Welcome to the Religious Studies Podcast.
hmm
Today we're going to do a deep dive into a text that's pretty foundational, in our field, Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. And just so you know, this whole episode is AI generated, but don't worry, religious studies. Scholar Bastian Friborg has triple-checked that everything's accurate. Now, I know Nietzsche can be a little dense at times, but trust me, we're going to pull out the juiciest, the most thought-provoking, maybe even scandalous bits.
Yeah, think of it like a cheat sheet to one of the most challenging texts in religious studies.
Exactly. Ready to have your assumptions about good and evil totally flipped on their head.
Oh, absolutely. Nietzsche is a master at shaking things up.
For sure.
What's so brilliant about the genealogy of morals is that he doesn't just analyze, moral systems. He really dissects their origins, their hidden motives, even their linguistic roots.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah.
He starts off by taking on these English psychologists who, in a very un-Nietzschean fashion, link goodness with altruism.
Right.
But Nietzsche's like, nope, you guys got it all backwards.
He flips the script entirely.
Totally.
For Nietzsche, good was first established by the powerful, the noble class.
Okay.
And it wasn't about being selfless. It was about embodying the qualities that they already possessed, Strength, beauty, even joy.
So being good was almost like a status symbol. Like, look at me, I'm strong, I'm successful, I must be inherently good.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Nietzsche digs even deeper, pointing out that the word good across different languages, often shares roots with words like aristocrat or truthful.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like he's uncovering these hidden connections between language, power, and morality.
Exactly. And if good is defined by the powerful, bad simply becomes whatever they aren't. The weak, the common, the powerless.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it. Even today, we still use language that connects morality with social status.
Totally.
Like, somebody who's low class is often seen as less trustworthy, even morally suspect.
Yeah.
Precisely. Nietzsche is showing us that these associations run deep. They shape our moral intuitions in ways we might not even realize. But here's where things get really interesting, even, I'd say, explosive. Nietzsche introduces this concept of a slave revolt in morals.
Okay, this is where Nietzsche starts to get a little controversial, right?
It's where he throws a grenade into conventional morality. He argues that the oppressed, fueled by resentment, what he calls ressentiment, basically flipped the script on the nobles.
So they took everything that the nobles valued, like strength, power, even happiness, and just redefined it as evil.
Exactly. And they took what the nobles despised, being humble, meek, suffering, and made those the hallmarks of goodness.
Ah.
It's a radical revaluation of values driven by this deep-seated resentment of those in power.
But why would they do that? I mean, if you're oppressed, wouldn't you want to become powerful yourself?
Right.
Wouldn't you want to emulate the strong?
That's where ressentiment comes in. It's not just about wanting what the powerful have. It's about hating them for having it. It's a simmering rage that says, since I can't be strong, I'll make strength itself seem evil.
Wow, that's intense. It's almost like a psychological defense mechanism.
Yeah.
If you can demonize the qualities you lack, it makes you feel less inadequate.
You're getting it. And this, according to Nietzsche, is how the concept of evil was born. Not from some inherent wickedness, but from the resentment of the powerless. It's a way to condemn those who have what you don't, and elevate yourself, morally speaking, at the same time.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this slave revolt could have huge implications. Like it's a blueprint for how the underdog can challenge the dominant moral order.
And Nietzsche takes it even further. He sees this revaluation of values playing out on this grand historical scale, particularly with the rise of Judaism and Christianity.
And this is where things get really interesting for us in religious studies.
Right.
Because he's not just talking about abstract philosophical concepts, he's connecting them to real-world religions.
And this is where we need to tread carefully.
Yeah.
Because Nietzsche's analysis is complex, controversial, and open to a lot of misinterpretation. But what he's suggesting essentially is that both Judaism and Christianity are prime examples of this slave morality in action.
So he's saying that these religions, with their emphasis on humility, self-sacrifice, and the rejection of worldly power, are actually products of that slave revolt.
That's his argument. And
Yeah.
he makes this particularly provocative claim about the Jewish people, saying that through this transvaluation of values, They enacted a kind of revenge on their oppressors.
Oh, okay, that's a bold statement.
He even quotes, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Israel, by turning values upside down, has triumphed over all other ideals, especially the more aristocratic ones.
Okay, so how does Christianity fit into all of this?
Right.
Because it seems like Jesus, at least on the surface, embodies many of those slave values that Nietzsche's talking about.
Exactly. And that's precisely why Nietzsche sees Jesus as the ultimate bait for this slave morality.
Okay.
He argues that Jesus, despite appearing harmless, further cemented these values, humility, self-sacrifice, love for one's enemies, into the dominant moral system of the West.
But here's a question. If Nietzsche's so critical of this slave morality, is he saying that we should all go back to worshiping strength and power? Is he endorsing some kind of might makes right worldview?
That's a great question, and it's one that often gets misunderstood about Nietzsche.
Okay.
He's not advocating for a simple return to a brutal Darwinian morality.
Gotcha.
What he's doing is much more subtle and I think more profound.
So it's not about taking sides, but understanding the deeper forces at play.
Exactly. He wants us to see how power, resentment, and even language itself have shaped our moral landscape.
It's like he's saying, look, these categories of good and evil that you take for granted, they're not eternal truths. They're products of history, of conflict, of human psychology.
You've got it. And recognizing that is the first step towards, well, that's where we'll pick up in part 2. This is going to get really, really interesting. They're tools that have been used and reshaped over centuries, sometimes for good, sometimes not so much.
Okay, so we've kind of uncovered these unsettling origins of good and evil.
Yeah.
It's definitely a mind-blowing idea. But what does Nietzsche actually want us to do with this knowledge?
That's the million-dollar question. See, Nietzsche worries that this slave morality, even if it was born out of this struggle for power, could actually hold us back as humans.
Hold us back? How
Yeah.
so? I mean, isn't it a good thing to value humility and compassion and all that?
On the surface, yeah, sure. But Nietzsche thinks it can go too far.
Okay.
He worries that a constant focus on self-denial and suffering can make us, as a species, a bit, well, tired.
Tired, like spiritually exhausted.
And more like lacking that drive, that ambition to really excel.
Right.
Nietzsche sees this will to power, not in a dominating sense, but like a striving creative force as essential to human progress.
So he's not saying we should all become ruthless tyrants, but that we shouldn't be afraid to aim high, to reach for greatness.
Exactly. And he worries that slave morality, if it becomes too dominant, can lead to a kind of nihilism.
Nihilism, like believing in nothing?
Yeah.
But isn't that the opposite of what religion usually does?
It's paradoxical, right? But Nietzsche sees it this way. If you're constantly focused on what's wrong with the world, on your own sinfulness, it can be hard to find meaning and value in life itself.
So instead of striving for something better, you get stuck in this cycle of guilt and self-punishment.
That's the danger Nietzsche sees. And I think we can even see echoes of this in our own time. Think about how some people focus so much on societal problems, injustices, not even to solve them, but almost to wallow in them.
Like it becomes that kind of identity, being the one who sees everything as wrong or broken.
Exactly. And that can be paralyzing. It saps the energy, the creativity we need to actually make things better.
Okay, that's a seriously thought-provoking connection. But I have to ask, what's Nietzsche's alternative then? What does he propose instead of this slave morality?
Well, he doesn't want us to blindly go back to worshiping the strong. That would be too simple. He
Yeah.
wants us to move beyond these categories altogether.
To create our own values. Isn't that a little dangerous? Like, who decides what's right and wrong then?
That's where Nietzsche introduces this famous and often misunderstood concept of the Übermensch.
Ah, yes, the Superman. I have to admit, I'm a bit intimidated by this concept. It sounds very elitist.
It's definitely been co-opted by some unsavory characters throughout history, but that's not what Nietzsche had in mind at all.
Okay.
The Übermensch isn't some blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan ideal. It's about transcending those conventional categories of good and evil altogether.
So it's not about physical strength or dominance, but more about inner strength.
Exactly. The Übermensch embraces their will to power, again, not in a tyrannical sense, but in a creative, life-affirming way.
Yeah.
They create their own values, not by rejecting morality, but by understanding its origins and then forging a path beyond it.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. But isn't that still incredibly difficult? I mean, most of us rely on existing moral frameworks to, guide us.
Of course. It's a challenge, no doubt. But Nietzsche's asking us to question everything, even our deepest moral instincts, to look for those places where slave morality might be holding us back, making us afraid to embrace our full potential.
Step outside that comfort zone of guilt and self-denial and say, hey, maybe there's more to life than
You
this.
got it. And this is where Nietzsche becomes so relevant to religious studies. He's asking us to look at religion not just as a set of beliefs, but as a product of this complex interplay of power, psychology, and human history.
It's almost like deconstructing religion to see what makes it pick.
Precisely. And that can be uncomfortable, even unsettling, especially for people with strong religious beliefs.
No.
But it can also be incredibly liberating.
Liberating. How so?
Because it gives you the freedom to choose what truly resonates with you, what
Yeah.
aligns with your own deepest values. It's not about throwing out religion altogether, but about approaching it with a more critical, questioning eye.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the depth and complexity of Nietzsche's thought.
Mm.
But I have to admit, this whole genealogy of morals idea, it makes me wonder about the origins of his own thinking.
Well, that's where things take a bit of a personal turn. Remember how we mentioned Nietzsche was heavily influenced by a book called The Origin of Moral Emotions?
Yeah.
Well, it was written by a man named Dr. Paul Ree, who became a close friend and part of one of the most intriguing, even scandalous chapters in Nietzsche's life.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What happened?
Picture this. It's the 1880s. Nietzsche gets introduced to this brilliant young woman named Lou Salome.
Okay,
She's a writer, a thinker, and completely captivating.
sounds like someone who would definitely catch Nietzsche's attention.
Oh, absolutely. And get this. At this point, Salome was close friends with Paul Ree, the same Ree who wrote that book on morality we talked about before.
Right.
They're practically inseparable.
So we got Nietzsche and this fascinating Salome all together. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, Nietzsche becomes totally smitten with Salome. I mean,
Right.
head over heels. He even proposed to her not once, but multiple times.
Wow. Talk about bold moves. Did she say yes?
She did not. Sadly for Nietzsche, Salome saw him as more of a mentor, a friend, but not a romantic partner.
Oh.
And to make things even more complicated, Paul Ree was also in love with her and also had his proposal rejected.
Oh my goodness. Talk about a recipe for awkwardness and heartbreak.
It really was a philosophical love triangle of epic proportions.
Yeah.
They spent a few intense weeks together. Then Salome decided to continue living with Ree platonically, of course.
Ouch. I bet Nietzsche took that pretty hard.
He was devastated. He wrote letters to both Ree and Salome pouring out his emotions. It's really quite something. You see this longing, despair, even self-pity. He even confessed to using substances to try to numb the pain.
It's kind of humbling to see this vulnerable side of Nietzsche. You know, the guy who wrote about the will to power and the Übermensch reduced to heartbreak.
It just goes to show that even the greatest minds are still human, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
So how did Nietzsche get through this? Did he ever recover from this heartbreak?
Well, it seems he channeled his pain into his work. Not long after this whole episode with Salome, he started writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one of his most celebrated works.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
He took this really tough personal experience and transformed it into philosophical gold.
It really speaks to his resilience and his ability to turn even the most difficult experiences into something meaningful.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So what about Paul Ree? How did he handle all this?
Sadly, Ree's story doesn't have such a triumphant ending.
Oh.
When Salome eventually got engaged to another man, he quietly withdrew from her life, leaving behind a note that simply said, "Have compassion, do not search for me."
Wow. That's heartbreaking.
It is Ree devoted himself to medicine, working as a doctor for the poor. But tragically, a few years later, he accidentally drowned during a hike.
That's so sad. It's like he could never quite escape the shadow of that unrequited love.
It's a reminder that even brilliant minds and passionate hearts can be broken by love.
Okay, so we've explored Nietzsche's groundbreaking ideas about morality, the complexities of power and resentment, and even a little bit of philosophical gossip.
Right. We've seen how his personal life, intellectual influences, and even his own struggles shaped his thinking.
And we've learned that even the most challenging philosophical texts can be full of surprises and even a little bit of drama.
Absolutely. Nietzsche reminds us that questioning our assumptions about morality is an ongoing process. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our values and then making conscious choices about the kind of people we want to be.
So the next time you find yourself making a moral judgment, take a moment to consider where that judgment is coming from. What are the historical roots? What are the power dynamics at play? And does it truly align with your own deeply held values?
Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals is a really powerful invitation to think critically about morality, to create a life that's both meaningful and authentic.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Nietzsche. It's been great.
It really has.
We hope this episode has given you a new perspective on good and evil and the ongoing struggle to define what it means to live a moral life.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
And to all our listeners out there, don't forget to check out the additional resources in the show notes. If you're interested in learning more, we'll see you in our next episode of the Religious Studies Podcast.